Good morning. I'm Frederick Biehle, and I'm going to read for you today a lecture that I prepared to present on Saturday morning in Canton, Ohio. The title of the lecture is August F. Biehle, Jr., the Kokoon Klub and the Becoming of a City. So let me start by sharing my screen. And you should now be seeing the first slide, which is just the title of the talk. August F. Biehle Jr. has long been considered one of the principal artists of the Cleveland School. Like his close friend William Summer, and unlike his most familiar colleagues Paul Travis, George Adamite, Henry Keller, and Carl Gertner, he was never a teacher at the Cleveland School of Art. He is not unique in that he, like them, was never able to independently support himself by his artistic production alone. Biehle worked as a lithographer for 40 years and, when able, a muralist. Despite these limitations on his time for his artistic pursuits, he was still one of the city's leading artists from the time of his return from study in Munich in 1912 until the Second World War, and thereafter one of its active senior statesmen until his death in 1979. For the Cleveland Museum's annual May shows, he would exhibit nearly 100 works. Biehle was initially trained as a decorator or decorative painter at a time when the word decorative was not pejorative. This meant being formally educated to translate the natural world by way of the stylized line, the arabesque. And there you see that sort of gestural act being traced throughout his entire career from 1903 to 1960. It would remain forever integral to his art. He wrote very little about his inner world or outer considerations as an artist, and this initially left him with something of an eclectic legacy. More recent scholarship has come to understand the greater diversity of his work. He not only painted in a variety of mediums, he engaged a full array of subject matter. His first submissions to the museum May shows support this, entering landscapes, portraits, and still lifes in oil and watercolor, decorative designs for murals, figure studies, and all variety of drawings. An examination of the works created for the Kokoon Klub only expands this list to include poster design, book cover and advertising, stage sets, even costumes. There was little he would not take on. Today, his career is better recognized for his professionalism and, most importantly, his versatility as an artist. The Kokoon Klub was an idea that came together at a very special moment in time. Its founder's intention was twofold: to pursue modern art and to pursue it collectively, working as a group to provide what they called mutual help. Quoting from Carl Mollman and Henry Adams and Lawrence Waldman's publication, Out of the Cocoon, quote, "Alone an artist becomes a routine man. He does the work before him and does it as work. But when enough artists get together as a club or a cooperative studio, then art, their work, becomes a living, vital thing. There is atmosphere, and atmosphere leads to inspiration, which comes from the exchange of ideas. It has the effect of making the work that of a Superman. It is an appreciation of the universe and of the beauty of life, not as an individual would realize it alone, but as a Superman would. And as we ordinary art workers do when we work together," end quote. That's a pretty remarkable statement, and I find it interesting that the organizers of the exhibit also borrowed from it in the promotion of the current exhibition. This quotation might be describing Biehle as he saw himself, a highly skilled but very much ordinary art worker, even if others did not, whose success or supermanness even celebrity, came about by virtue of his connection to others. The idea of the collective defined his life as a decorator, as a lithographer, as a muralist, and as a cocooner. The Kokoon Klub was perhaps the longest lasting and certainly his most important collective. Quite in contrast to the image of the artist today, Biehle was never a loner. And because he found identity by being part of a group, he was its most ardent and participant and contributor. 1911, the year of the Kokoon Klub's creation, was an especially fertile moment in America for the emergence of an urban identity arising out of the City Beautiful movement, for the city of Cleveland as a beneficiary of that movement, and for the birth of modern art. It is no wonder, really, that a group of lithographic artists would join together to celebrate what was happening around them. They were kicking off a cultural transformation that would continue to thrive for the next 2 decades, and even in spite of the Depression, carry on until the Second World War. The Biehle story really begins 3 decades before this with the emigration of 2 brothers, August Frederick Biehle and Frederick August Biehle. Both were master decorators and fresco artists trained in Bavaria. They had come to northern Ohio, to Cleveland, in part because it had been advertised in southern Germany as the Forest City. It was the land and its familiar landscape that had seduced them. Cleveland had needed artisans like them, and they had heeded the call and would prosper. The master was the designer of the decorative program, working with the building's architect to assemble an overall scheme that could integrate its architecture, decoration, and furnishings harmoniously. The workshop the brothers established was made up primarily of decorative painters like themselves, who worked directly on the finished plaster walls and ceiling, or on canvas that could be later applied. They created motifs, often floral works, featured perspective views, and trompe-l'oeil effects representing materials like wood and marble. Ornamental detail was created both in plaster relief as well as painted illusion. Immediately integrated into Cleveland's German-American community, there was no shortage of work. August Frederick Jr. was born in 1885, his father's only son, but also one of 6 male cousins that, starting at the age of 14, would be apprenticed to the family business. Some of Biehle's first drawings are of decorative ornament, beginning a process of delineating the subject matter that would span his future profession. By the late 19th, early 20th centuries, the landscape of the decorator began to change. Louis Rohrheimer was an important figure that exemplified the transformation from the craftsman as the master decorator to an interior designer employing separate crafts to provide the woodwork, decorative finishes, and furniture. It would be his Rohrheimer Brooks studio that offered the Biehle workshop subcontract work in their specialty. And because Rohrheimer was interested in a more modern sensibility, it would make sense to send young August to be better trained in Munich and thereby learn the latest styles and techniques. It would keep the workshop ahead of the competition. Well before Biehle's departure, Munich had become a major center for the arts. As the capital of Bavaria, it remained so through the latter half of the 19th and into the 20th century. Its art culture thrived, and its institutions attracted students from both Eastern and Western Europe, as well as Americans of European and particularly German descent. From Northern Ohio, Frank Duveneck was at the Munich Royal Academy between 1870 and 73. Duveneck would be a teacher of Karl Mollmann. Frank Gottwald studied there between 1882 and 85. Gottwald would teach Biehle. William Sommer, Biehle's compatriot, was at the Royal Academy in 1890 and 91. Henry Keller, another Biehle colleague and teacher, earned a silver medal at the Academy while studying there from 1899 to 1902. August F. Biehle Jr. would study in Munich twice, initially between 1903 and 5, and then during the city's even more fertile period in 1911 and 12. Munich had an artistic life of extraordinary activity and variety, cultivating a climate of expression and debate. And it was a tumultuous time, giving voice to a difference that eventually crowded out the pedagogy of the academy. The first to be called secessionists were a group of Munich artists who organized a group exhibit in 1892 challenging the official academic status of Franz von Lenbach. The arts magazine Jugend was started in 1896 and would lend its name to Jugendstil, the German variant of Art Nouveau. Many of the Munich painters, like August Endel, Julius Dietz, and Hermann Obrist, applied themselves not to painting, but to design, in keeping with the movement. Die Schol was a group that wanted to, quote, sing praise to the Mother Earth, to their native soil in their pictures, end quote. Influenced by Impressionism and Neo-Impressionism with brighter palettes and broader brushstrokes, their work was particularly suited to poster and book design, ornamentation, and magazine illustration. Working for the magazine Jugend, they became important exponents of Jugendstil, and yet, even under such radical circumstances, Munich was still widely perceived internationally as an art culture more staid and practical, where one went to study so as to acquire a solid grounding in technique. August F. Biehle Jr. departed from Cleveland for Munich in October of 1903 at the age of 18. There he is, and there he is also in the background on the boat over. He was already a skilled draftsman, having been apprenticed to his father for the prior 3 years, working in Cleveland, Chicago, and St. Louis. He would later say that his father sent him to Munich to keep him out of the saloons and beer halls, which seems somewhat fanciful given his lifelong disregard for alcohol in general. Another story related by his nephew, Burton Castle, was the one I mentioned, that his father, as his apprentice master, sent him to Germany to be trained in the latest decorative techniques and styles and bring the Biehle business up to date. Regardless of the reason, AFB Jr. was accepted for study at the Munich Kunstgewerbeschule, the principal school teaching both fine and decorative arts and distinguishing between neither. It had become the center for the teaching of Jugendstil, not just for Munich, but for all of Europe. At the time, this technique was extending into all aspects of the fine and applied arts, including painting and architecture. The idea of the total work of art, a synthesis of painting, sculpture, architecture, and ornament with a contemporary theme, was quite prevalent, particularly so in Vienna and Bavaria. In 1903, it was the Kunstgewerbeschule that embraced this zeitgeist, as opposed to the more traditional Royal Academy. Biehle learned the exercises requiring him to draw from nature and then transform the drawings into flattened decorative motifs like these here on the screen. He produced large ornamental details, plant studies, insect and animal studies, and graphic designs intended for advertising and posters using primarily ink, watercolor, and gouache. It is safe to say that Biehle became caught up in the culture of the city together with the pleasure of his studies. He corresponded with his family regularly, most often by postcard. During his semester breaks, he traveled to visit his father and mother's immediate families in the nearby towns of Salem, Ottenheim, Amt, Lahr, Baden, and Freiburg. Securing his diploma in July of 1905, he returned to Cleveland, where he would transpose the idea of his German experience, the bridging of both the fine and decorative arts, back onto his former context. Initially, he would live at home and contribute to his father's decorating work. But in 1908, he found work as a colorist at the Sherwin-Williams Paint Company in the Flats, which would continue intermittently until 1913. There on the top is a a brochure produced by Sherwin-Williams that shows him demonstrating and exhibiting how one does stencil work. And there below is a stencil from the Biehle workshop. And on the right is kind of remarkable painting that depicts the view from the windows of the Sherwin-Williams plant of the flats that he painted in 1908. During this period, and there he is in Sherwin-Williams, upper left, during this period, he attended evening art classes at the Cleveland School of Art under Frederick Gottwald. And it was most likely here that he befriended fellow student Elmer Brubeck. That's Brubeck upper right, from 1910. Brubeck and another young artist, William Zorak, were colleagues working at Otis Lithograph. And somewhere a plan was made to return to Europe for study in Paris. In January of 1911, a postcard from Brubeck sent to August at the Biehle family address on West 58th Street was forwarded to him in Youngstown, where he was working on a commission. It says, quote, "Dear friend Biehle, I hope this card will not find you there, but will see you here instead, in Paris, the greatest city ever." Biehle would shortly be arriving. Together with Brubeck and Zorak, he would attend night figure classes and visit figure drawing classes and visit the celebrated museums. This is where the magic was supposed to happen. But the grand experiment didn't work for him. He decided that he would instead return to Munich for a second stay and give the Royal Academy a try. Brubeck didn't remain in Paris longer than the next summer, as he was back in Cleveland in time to be included as a founding member of the Kokoon Klub. Zorak held on a bit longer, even traveling to visit Biehle in Munich before heading back to Cleveland at the end of 1911. The formative development of Wassily Kandinsky's artistic career also took place in Munich between the years 1896 and 1914, so bookending the two periods of Biehle's study there. He came to painting later in life and specifically chose Munich as the place to pursue his artistic training. First privately, and then later at the Royal Academy under Franz von Stuck. During Biehle's first stay, Kandinsky was exhibiting under the Phalanx Group, an artist club modeled on the Secessionists. During 1903 and 04, these exhibits included works by a number of French post-impressionists working with novel color. In 1909, Kandinsky was exhibiting with another group he helped to form, the Neue Künstlervereinigung, who described themselves as manifesting a high degree of economy, synthesis, and spiritualization. But it was the formation of the Blau Reiter and their activities specifically during the years 1911 and 12 that made Munich a true center of the avant-garde. The Blau Reiter group was organized as a more advanced collective in the wake of Kandinsky's falling out with his own NKV, who had rejected his composition number 5 in their third exhibition. That's it right there. Encouraged by an exchange with Franz Marc, the two collaborated on a name for themselves and an exhibition that would run at the Tannhauser Gallery. The first Blau Reiter exhibit included, in addition to Kandinsky and Marc, Gabriel Munter, August Mack, and Robert Delaunay. The immediate success of the exhibit was evidenced by the fact that it traveled to so many other European cities: Berlin, Frankfurt, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Vienna, Prague, and its work, of course, subsequently included in the International Exhibition of Modern Art, sponsored by the Sonderbund in Cologne. This was the exhibit that would become the model for the Armory show in New York. There was a second Blau Reiter exhibit in February at the Hans Gols Gallery with even more contributors, such as Ernst Kirchner, Emil Nold, and Max Pechstein. A few months later, in the spring of 1912, the Blau Reiter Almanac was published, and its 1,200 copies sold out immediately. Biehle was there, and he purchased one. Retrospectively, it would appear that Kandinsky's move to the spiritual in art, his concerted investigations into pure abstraction, might have dominated the city in these years. But avant-garde interests were quite wide. Van Gogh, the French Cubists, the Berlin Expressionists, De Bruyck, Matisse, all were being exhibited. The publication Der Sturm was promoting the Italian Futurists, Boccacconi and Severini. Paul Klee, too, was in Munich at this period. This on the screen was the context for young Biehle. And even so, the Blaureiter Almanac that he purchased has now been called the, quote, most significant programmatic document in the history of 20th century German art, end quote, continuing to influence artists up to this very day. Biehle had returned to Munich in the spring of 1911 with very different intentions. He took a room in the Schwabing district where he could revisit the Kunstgewerbeschule. There, he was able to take a class under Julius Dietz, who taught the nature studies and plaster cast courses. As a muralist and poster artist, he would influence an entire generation of designers. Dietz's most modern designs were for posters, one of which was for an advertisement for Pelican Artists Colors using a pelican. The animal motif, in particular birds, for formal as well as symbolic interest, was common. Between 1903 and 5, Biehle had done studies of the bluebird, the owl, and the turkey. These would all be appropriated and rendered again as flattened gouache shapes to be applied as compositional figures within the rectangular format of the poster or book cover illustration. And those are, I believe, his very first drawings under Dietz at the bottom. The reconfiguring of an earlier study would become part of Biehle's working method. In the 1910s, he continued to select from his Kunstgewerbeschule studies. A study for the cover of Signet magazine used his owl studies, and the poster he created for his own exhibition of landscapes in 1912 returned to the wild turkey, as you can see on the right. Here we see his bird motif along the bottom reapplied as a mural sketch, and then later, even later, as another cover for Bystander magazine. The bluebird and the peacock became the motifs that dominated his illustrational work from 1911 all the way into the 1930s. He employed them repeatedly in poster designs, book cover illustrations, theater brochure designs, advertisements, interior decoration, and mural work. Once he was more comfortable with his intentions, Biehle created a series of figure drawings that he presented to pass the entry exam for the Royal Academy. By this time, the Academy itself was incorporating turn-of-the-century ideas by way of its changing faculty. Franz von Stuck, still widely regarded as for his expressive style and sensuous symbolic content typifying Jugendstil, was now the director. Yet the story that comes out of this period is the result of one of William Zorach's letters, who visited Biehle there in November. He claims that Biehle was suffering under a stifling academic curriculum producing nothing but portraits. In a letter to his wife, Marguerite, once he was back in Cleveland in 1912, he says, quote, "I went down to Corner and Wood's gallery today to see how things were getting on with the exhibit. And who do you suppose I met there but Biehle? Biehle is the young fellow who showed me all around Munich. He had all his things there, and oh, girl, I was so surprised. I became all enthusiastic and excited and discouraged and sore and everything. To think that I had to live in a country like this where there was such little interest when I saw his stuff. He had them all lined up around the walls. They are all ink drawings and opaque watercolor sketches, drawings, etc., all on the order of that Jugend stuff, the sort of German litho style. They showed influence of Munich, beautiful poster designs. Many were the regulation German stunt, but he had a few, dear, that you would like. Very good. When I got to Munich, Biehle was going to the academy, drawing from casts, etc. He had just 2 drawings to show for about 4 months' work. And I always knew Biehle from Cleveland as having a very fine sense of design. And I felt that he could do fine things in the new way. I told him, for God's sake, get away from the academy. And he did. And you can imagine how surprised I was to see his work. End quote. It would appear that Biehle might have taken Zorach's advice, spending the better part of his remaining time in Munich, not at the academy, but painting out of doors instead. In particular, in the moors of the small towns surrounding the city, areas becoming artist colonies. But he was also influenced by the work of De School Group, through another of his professors, Angelo Yank, that's some of Yank's work along the top. So whether or not, as a result of Zorach's urging, he took to painting outdoors, he did take to painting outdoors. He would say that he painted upwards of 100 landscapes, only a third of which are known today. The works in the family archive from the second stay in Europe, other than the figure studies in Paris and some portraits, are almost entirely of landscape in a variety of mediums, mostly pencil and opaque watercolor, but already beginning to mix the two with the graphic sensibility that became another one of his signatures. And it's exactly the kind of thing that you see in these 2 images from Angelo Yank, that mixture of graphic and opaque watercolor. The Bavarian landscapes are interesting in that they show Biehle already focused on the specific formal concerns that would be foundational to his career. First was to the frontal structuring of the pictorial window, defining the scene as flattened layers, often with an extensive foreground. The subject typically occupies the middle ground, with the foreground breaking down into a more abstract pattern. The subject is represented with a conscious awareness of figured negative space, which comes out of his earlier Jugendstil training and decorative experience. It can be seen especially in the finer detail of trees and their branches. Go back to this previous one. Compare these 2 here. If we compare the Kunstgewerbeschule drawing in the upper left of plants done in 1903 and understand the process as a visual intention carried over from a controlled into a natural setting, there is a flattening of the negative space into shapes and thus a painting of it in such a way as to leave the branch as the leftover on the page. It's in this image. Such a comparison shows his transition from illustrative to fine artist. A second characteristic is the use of mixed medium of graphite together with watercolor and gouache, what Zorach refers to as the German litho style. The work of Angelo Yank, as I noted, is also characteristic of this. One can see the outlining of the composition in graphite, to which the gouache or watercolor is layered in to establish ground, sky, and subject. The overdrawing on the gouache, again, as shading and articulation, especially foliage, is what gives the paintings their particular style. Still, a third issue is the handling of the foreground, middle ground, and background. In the painting of the moors, both of these actually, and the open field, there is a need to distinguish the foreground. Biehle creates 2 distinct treatments. One is the abstract patterning of the landscape, which you see on the left. The second is the introduction of an intruding foreground shadow, allowing the viewer to share with the artist a preferred sheltered position. One looks out to the sunlit view beyond proscenium like where the natural and architectural performance takes place. These are clearly the works that Zorak was admiring. By the early 20th century, Cleveland, which had evolved to become one of the fastest growing cities in America, hoped to transform its industrial image and become a city to match the political clout of its statesmen like John Hay and the wealth of its business elites, such as John D. Rockefeller. The map of Cleveland from 1836, which already shows you Public Square, and then from 1900 with Euclid Avenue identified. Already leading out of Public Square was Millionaire's Row, which is Euclid Avenue stretching east, the site of numerous projects that had been decorated by the Biehle brothers. City leaders, as part of what was a national response to the remarkably influential Chicago World's Exposition of 1893, engaged the fair's planner, Daniel Burnham, to create a new civic plan for Cleveland. His commission, which included the architects John Carrere and Arnold Brunner, produced what was called simply the Group Plan, which intended to create or rebuild the city's 6 most important civic structures and organize them around an axial open space, a mall or court of honor, as it was to be called. The plan was released publicly in 1903. There it is on the left. And demolition to clear the site started soon after. The federal courthouse was the first structure to be completed, with work continuing by presenting a new building every few years. City Hall, the post office, the public library, the public auditorium, all over the next 2 decades. The setting for what were all to be stately Beaux-Arts style buildings was an even grander public space located just down Superior Avenue from Public Square. And here's a 1906 map in which, even though completely unbuilt, the group plan has been indicated. The map is actually there to show you the new bridges that were being constructed to connect the east and west sides. But the plan does include the group plan, interestingly, which is now highlighted. Perhaps second only to the National Mall in Washington, D.C., it would be one of the earliest and most complete city beautiful planning schemes in the country. The only piece of the plan that would never be realized was perhaps its most crucial, Central Rail Station along the waterfront of the lake. Station, which you see here, right, on axis with that mall. The station, with both local and national train lines, would have activated the mall as a significant city-scale threshold, the place of arrival and departure, would have energized the mall with pedestrian traffic and influenced the development of more commercial activity. Instead, the local train lines were relocated to Public Square beneath the Terminal Tower, which opened in 1927. Almost simultaneously with the group plan, an arts and cultural center was coming to life around what is called University Circle, where Euclid Avenue turned back to parallel Lake Erie on the city's east end, 100 blocks from the Public Square. It was an area already occupied by Case and Western Reserve universities. The City Beautiful movement had a powerful influence here as well in the planning for a cluster of new cultural buildings in the more natural setting of Wade Park. Cleveland School of Art opened there in 1905, the Cleveland Museum in 1916, and Severance Hall 3 years later. So after 1910, things just kept happening. Playhouse Square opened in 1921 with the State, Ohio, Allen, Palace, and Hanna theaters. New civic projects appeared constantly. It must have been not only an incredibly exciting time, but one that evoked civic pride, being part of something so big and collectively beneficent. As Stephen Kahn has written in his interesting book, Americans Against the City, Anti-Urbanism in the 20th Century, this was perhaps urban America's brief shining moment. And Cleveland, now the country's sixth largest city, it clearly showed. From early on, Cleveland had a streetcar system, but after 1905, the east and west sides had become fully integrated, making everything easily accessible. 1912, Biehle lived with his parents on Denison Avenue on the west side within the German enclave where the family had always resided. And in fact, on this map showing the streetcar lines, the kind of extensive streetcar lines for the city, these three dots indicate those three places where the Biehle family had lived up to this point. In 1914, William Summer could purchase a farm and schoolhouse in Brandywine, which is out here, and still reaches a appointed job at Otis Lithograph without a car. It was just a short walk over to the Kokoon Clubhouse on East 36th Street before heading home. Laukoff's bookshop at the Taylor Arcade, the Taylor Department Store Gallery, the Hatch Studios and Galleries, the Kokoon Club's three different East Side locations, Otis Lithograph's new building on Payne Avenue at 30th Street, all more or less downtown. And then starting in 1916 with the opening of the Cleveland Playhouse at 73rd and Cedar, the museum and Symphony Hall, all part of University Circle with the School of Art and Universities. It's out here. So this was their world, and everything was accessible. See the ubiquitous streetcar in these images from the time. August Biehle hadn't been the first Northern Ohio artist to return to Munich for study, but he would be the one present when Wassily Kandinsky and Franz Marc staged their first Blaureiter exhibit. At that moment, Munich enjoyed an artistic life of extraordinary activity and variety, cultivating a climate of expression and debate, a German complement with Paris as European centers for the arts. Kandinsky, in an article of 1930 lamenting the trends that stamped out much of that artistic culture, spoke of the city then, quote, "Despite everything, Schwabing remains dear to me. In those days, so loud and bustling, it has become silent, a pity for funny and somewhat eccentric and self-confident Schwabing, in whose streets a person, whether man or woman, not carrying a palette, a canvas, or at the very least a portfolio, was immediately conspicuous. Like an intruder in a nest, everybody painted or wrote poetry or played music or learned to dance. In every house, one could find under the eaves at least two studios, in which many of which not so much painting went on as a constant discussion, debate, philosophizing, and a good measure of drinking," end quote. Seeped in that world for a year and a half, having toiled under the eaves of the studio and outdoors in the moors, Biehle returned to Cleveland no longer a decorator, but a matured 27-year-old painter, a fine artist trained at one of Europe's finest schools. Cleveland, not unlike Munich, was also a city vibrant with its own change. The lithograph industry that was centered there offered opportunity and community for artists, producing a culture eager for news of the latest thinking abroad. Biehle was full up with that news and the visual knowledge to communicate it. The exhibits he was immediately offered supported both his new skill set as well as the open-mindedness of the community. Biehle returned briefly to Sherwin-Williams upon his return, where he produced some advertisements that used his German landscapes. He also painted a new version of the flats, which is there, with a very different color palette. These are the Sherwin-Williams advertisements, and this is his painting from the immediate vicinity of Sherwin-Williams. Almost immediately in 1913, he would be hired by Otis Lithograph Company as a black artist to produce the actual drawings for the poster images on the lithograph stone with a black touche crayon. He worked under the tutelage of both William Summer and Carl Mollman. It was only natural that they would invite him to join in the evening figure drawing sessions and weekend outings of their recently created Kokoon Klub. In spite of the nearly 20-year age difference, Biehle became inseparable from his new mentor, Summer. And for that first year, his old friend Zorak. The three of them spent their weekends painting outdoors while discussing philosophy and literature. Biehle would later write in a note to the collector Joseph Erdelak, "I am thankful that you liked my work well enough that you wanted some examples and that it will hang with Bill Summers. We painted together more than any two artists I ever knew of." It was through their painting together that an exchange of ideas took place. Zorak was already versant in the free associative use of color by way of Matisse and the Fauves in Paris. Biehle shared his copy of the Blaureiter Almanac with its broad and eclectic gathering of current works and historical references, all pointing toward a search for the spiritual in art. Its impact and influence, evident in certain tentative efforts in Germany, became very much present in the modern works that all three artists produced. Adams writes of the significant impact of the Armory Show on William Summer in early 1913. There's no doubt that the force of that thinking would have impacted Biehle as well. I really don't think that the deposition, which is the upper right image, which he painted in 1913, could have been done without that impact. Tracking the direct correspondence in the painting between these three artists is really not an easy thing to do. There are no catalog raisonnés for any of them. Few of the works are appropriately dated, and so many works are frankly unknown. But the deposition was certainly done in 1913 in Brandywine, as was Zorak's Spring, which is below it. And the Summer on the left, which is in the Akron Museum, is dated circa 1915. So the connections between, I think, these three images is a little too obvious. Summer, Zorak, and Biehle were looking to express something beyond the material present. Their paintings intentionally became more primitive and direct. It is what made the works consciously modern. And of course, all of what they produced, landscape primarily, but also urban scenes, still life, figurative and narrative subject, is filtered through the lens of dynamic color. What bursts forth is a world in which the natural landscape has been transformed into an endless Garden of Eden. The optimism it exudes is infectious. Opportunities to exhibit their latest paintings remained constant and recurrent in the early 19-teens, but the sale of those works was less frequent. The result was an ever-accumulating catalog of paintings available for the next exhibit. This is why Jesse Glazier, the art critic for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, could state about the Kokoon Klub exhibit of April 1916, quote, "August Biehle showed a wood interior in soft browns, greens, and grays that had the soothing effect of temple aisles, while futuristic canvases of a very different type bore his signature elsewhere in the room," end quote. He is with some certainty referring to one of Biehle's Munich landscapes, which I've plugged in right here, that he had included and exhibited alongside his more recent paintings, and with a certain degree of irony, received superior praise for. Lithography in Cleveland was already a robust business, employing hundreds of artists. Because the deadlines tended to be seasonal or project-based, with a sympathetic employer, schedules could be set up to allow for compensation time off particularly in the summers, for the artists to paint. Before the art center of the world shifted to New York in the 1930s, there was a broader place for artists in the community of artists in America. Poster design and commercial lithography was an established and respectable venue. Cleveland was the country's capital for commercial lithographers, providing posters for theatrical performances and the emergent film market. Otis Lithograph, seeking to distinguish its work, had hired the recognized poster artist Carl Mollman from New York to jazz up its brand. Mollman had hired his friend Bill Summer to be the firm's principal illustrator. Under the leadership of Mollman and Summer, a small group of artists met as the Kokoon Klub for the first time in August 1911. The club's purpose was to pursue their shared interest in modern art. Other than Mollman and Summer, there were 11 charter members, including Elmer Brubeck, Morris Grossman, Joseph Garamond, Gustav Blas, Frank Mayer, and Harry Stebner. 7 others joined the following year, including August F. Biehle, Jr. The Kokoon Klub was intended to provide a place to gather, to sketch from live models, and to sponsor lectures, presentations, and exhibitions, both group shows of their members as well as solo exhibits. They started by meeting 2 evenings a week in space rented above a tailor's shop on East 36th Street south of Prospect Avenue. Adams mentions repeatedly the role of painting from the nude, how it was both consistently mentioned in the press and simultaneously promoted by the club as a form of provocation. I can say that the archive of the August Biehle studio contains an enormous number of figure drawings in all variety of medium. I recently found it quite interesting to find what seems to be the same pose, certainly the same model, between Biehle and Summer, as you see in the left. Nearly all the members came from the commercial arts, in particular lithographers, but also designers, decorators, and engravers. They had exhibited collectively in February of 1912 at the Taylor Department Store Gallery, and they would do so again in 1913. 1913 was the year of the Armory Show in New York, a seminal event for modern art in America, and one characterized by outrage and scandal. The exhibit had included Henry Keller, who would become a Kokoon Klub member. Summer went to New York to see the exhibit. The following year, the club organized its own exhibit of modernist works, continuing what was proving to be a tradition of notoriety. Also in 1913, the Kokoon Klub introduced the event for which it would be defined, the ball mask. Renting the Elk Lodge, it would be open to the public as a fundraiser. Posters, of course, would be needed to announce it. Decorations would be needed to set the ambiance for the event. These are probably the very first drawings by Biehle directly connected to the Kokoon Klub. Similar to his sketches from 1911, he is designing a poster and clearly thinking of the critical theme of metamorphosis from chrysalis to butterfly. Quoting from Robert Bordner and Adams and Waldman again, quote, "The guests arrived in the more conventional masquerade costumes. The lights went out and a dim spotlight gleamed on the almost naked bodies of 4 huge Negro men bearing a giant cocoon through the throng. When the litter was deposited on the stage, the chrysalis opened, brass cymbals clashed, and a girl floated out in a dance of butterfly wings. Earnshaw, dressed as Mephistopheles, commanded the crowd. The lights went black again, and suddenly there were nearly 20 naked club members, painted as Indians, howling and dancing across the floor. This was to be about dropping conventions, of forgetting the ordinary world, and of letting go in complete carnival." The ball, of course, would in time become everything the founders had hoped for, an ambitious application of modern principles that could include the larger public, an anticipated performance art spectacle growing more fantastic and thus challenging to reinvent every passing year. With the opening of the Cleveland Playhouse and other civic platform contributed to the mix of offerings. Both Biehle and Summer would design sets and posters for the Playhouse. 1918, they sponsored a one-man exhibit of Biehle's work. The upper right image is an example of the crossover between the club, social engagement, and fine art production. In a note on the back, Biehle says, quote, an imaginative picture made after seeing the fireplace in Mr. Brooks' house on Cedar Avenue and 73rd Street, who was president of the Playhouse. Raymond O'Neill was director of plays, end quote. It was a drawing that nearly caught fire for him, excuse the pun, as he keeps it going through an entire series, most clearly related back to the reverie of the Kokoon Klub ball. 1916 was the visit of the Ballet Russe. We have the program from August Biehle's attendance on the left, complete with his sketches on top of it, which was something he did with most of his books, as you can see on the right, which he always carried with him. The costume designs by Leon Bakst, and maybe even more so for the artists, his drawings of the figures in costume were obviously a big influence on the imaginings of the club and their poster and costume works. In just a very few years, Biehle's life as an artist became balanced between his work with Summer and Otis lithograph and his evenings with colleagues at the Kokoon Klub, punctuated by gallery openings, musical and theatrical performances, and other events. All of it, of course, culminating with the annual ball. So it's interesting to follow the connection between what he is painting in the landscape and the energy that runs through the drawings for the club. Hillside houses now hanging in the Cleveland Museum, which he painted in 1916 of an area near his family home on the city's west side, pulses with that same energy. And his Ghost in the Falls, which is in the Akron Museum collection, done from sketches in Brandywine, has its mythological figures dancing. In 1917, he goes to New York City to track down his friend Zorak, and they visit the galleries together, including Stieglitz's 291. This is his sketchbook from that trip. We also have what I believe are his first mural sketches produced for the ball, as they are so specific as to dimension and existing opening. The Cleveland Museum opened in 1916, perhaps the most important of all the civic achievements for the community of Cleveland artists, but it would be their annual May shows starting in 1918 that shifted the center of gravity for the exhibition of new art away from the Kokoon Klub. The museum now has an entire archive of material that's online. It's very interesting to look at this, and so they have a lot of the May Show images. And I just went through it just the other day quickly and pulled out their two images by Biehle. This is from the early 20s. This is the mid 30s, but there, right on the wall, are two of his paintings. In 1919, the club purchased a house at 1323 Euclid Avenue. Biehle helped to inaugurate it with his first Kokoon solo exhibit that December. Herman Matson of the Cleveland School of Art gave a talk, and Charles Harrick played the piano. The works on display were more than 50 paintings of scenes around Berlin Heights, gardens, fields, and hillsides in full sunlight. This is Henry Keller's painting, Student at Work, which is actually a depiction of Biehle out at Berlin Heights. We know those Berlin Heights paintings quite well. That is, we, the family, know them quite well. And they're really quite dispersed. But this must have been a formidable show of optimism and spirit. There are four of them. There are four others of them. They have a formal exactitude, but simultaneously, I think, capture a kind of rapture to the landscape, to the world around him. 1919 had been the first year that his poster design was used. This is the sketch for it, and then these are some details from it. The only extant copy is in rather poor shape. That's thus the details. Um, and here's the photograph that you've probably seen before of that 1919 ball. And there's Biehle in the back. It had been an amazing couple of years. In 1918, he had a solo exhibit at Lindner's Gallery in February, another solo show of smaller works at Lakoff's bookstore in April. He participated in the first May show at the Cleveland Museum in May. He was in a group show at Lindner's Tea Room in November, and he had a solo exhibit at the Cleveland Playhouse that same month. In 1919, it was a summer painting at Berlin Heights, and then his first solo exhibit at the new Kokoon Klub. Once again, to show the crossover between his illustration work for posters for the club and his more staid fine arts work. This is an image from Berlin Heights, and note the similarity of the clouds. Here's the ball from 1921, and there again he is in the middle. In 1921, Biehle's rapture would carry over into marriage. He was 36 years old and started a family immediately. It would be a few years before the true nature of the change took hold, but the 1931 brochure for the ball, which lists the members and their accomplishments, with a witty description of each, says simply about Biehle, quote, is married now, end quote. I think we can read between the lines on that. The early 1920s would see a renewed fascination with the flats and the steel mills, the industrial landscape that had captivated him upon his return from Munich. And I believe it was around the same time that he designed an advertisement for the Hudson Motor Car Company and a book plate for his colleague, friend, and mentor, Carl Mollman, using the same composition of figures. And here's the married couple at the big event. It's a testament to the times that Biehle, working as a lithographer, was able to purchase a lot and build his own home in a New Parma subdivision about a mile south from where he had grown up on the west side. While it would eventually become as dense as that plan called for, the first 25 years were quite sparsely built and felt almost like a rural area, as you can see in the photograph. May, his wife, always had a big garden with flowers that he would paint and fruit trees. For the 1926 ball, Biehle was the designer of the souvenir. And we also have an elaborate set of mural drawings for what must have been that same thematically linked event. 1927, his design was used for the ticket to the Golden Ball. 1929 was the ball dynamic. Same year, his 1927 illustration was used for Bystander magazine. And I like this sort of thematically linked Christmas card from the year before. The train wreck that's coming is clearly nowhere in view. Otis Lithograph had been purchased by its arch rival Morgan Lithograph in 1924. As Biehle says in some of his notes, Morgan was a ruthless businessman. The climate of the working environment changed overnight. By 1926, Summers and Mollman could take no more and left to start up a new rival, Continental Lithograph. would take Biehle a few more years to make the switch, yet even under sympathetic owners, the Depression did its damage, and within a short period of time in the early 1930s, everyone was out of work. In 1932, Biehle made an effort to commercially produce his own work, almost as if making a portfolio. He selected images of past paintings, including Ottenheim Amt Lahr, which is on the upper left, done while studying in Germany. The images he created were all unnumbered artist proofs made from zinc plates, printed with black ink on colored and off-white papers, some of them in hand colored. There were 30 different images, and mixed in among the natural and urban landscapes are, of course, Kokoon Klub related themes, but without question, the optimism that just, is intrinsic to the Kokoon Klub's existence and its reflection in the artwork that's being produced for it and adjacent to it is just simply not present in these images. Mural work proved to be an opportune synthesis of Biehle's decorative and lithographic training and fine art ambitions, as it would be for Summers as well. In 1933, he was fortunate enough to go to Chicago to work on the Century of Progress World Exhibition as part of the WPA initiative. Edwin Summers, son of William, was the leader with 40 other Cleveland artists, producing 12 murals for the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. Biehle was given design responsibility and direction of one of the painting crews for which these two images were created. Hermann Perchner was an Austrian immigrant to Cleveland who had become quite well known as the purveyor of several theater district supper clubs, often modeled on Tyrolean themes reminiscent of his childhood. The Alpine Village opened in 1931. How Perchner and Biehle met is not known, but quite fortuitously for Biehle in 1933, Perchner commissioned him to produce 27 murals for the Alpine Village. There would be mountain scenes and images of Bavarian peasant life. The restaurant remained open until 1961 and drew some of the biggest names in entertainment for performances, as well as patronage. Biehle's relationship with Perchner would endure as he continued to employ him to produce murals for each and every one of his numerous entrepreneurial endeavors. The El Dorado Club, a second Alpine at the Great Lakes Festival, the Showboat, the Hofbrau, and the redecoration of the Alpine in 1942. Perchner became someone quite close to being a patron that carried him through the Depression years. 1935 seems to have been a particularly productive year for his art as he burst forth with these two oversized paintings. In the 1930s, the Kokoon Klub began to decline as the Depression took its toll. Many members were out of work, and the younger artists moved to New York. But Biehle remained a contributor to the end, doing the poster in 1937. Here it is, and the ticket to the Silver Jubilee Ball in 1938. It is interesting that given his 40 years as a lithographer, what they called a black artist, he kept little of the commercial poster work that he did for Otis and Continental Lithograph, except for the poster paper itself, which he began cutting up and using as drawing paper in the 1930s. At that time, many of his preliminary sketches were drawn on litho poster paper. All of these drawings, each of which is a drawing, these drawings on the screen, each of which is a drawing from memory upon arrival at work after crossing over the flats from the west side, was drawn on the back of poster paper. Lithography may have been his livelihood, which he needed to support his family, continuing with it until his retirement in 1952, but it was not his chosen profession, which he was able to engage only evenings and weekends. In 1945, at the end of World War Two, he recalled those images to make a celebratory painting, Victory, that utilized a vision of his city of Cleveland. August Biehle was the last of the Cocooners to go. He had joined in its second year, and the only reason he wasn't part of the founding is because he was away in Munich. He was still a member 44 years later when the club was dissolved in 1956. In dividing up the club's assets, the Steinway grand piano, originally purchased for the East 21st Street address, was given to him. He was also a singer, after all, and his daughter Rita, a pianist. He outlived all of his friends, one of the few things that made him sad. William Sommer, his closest friend and mentor, died in 1949, 30 years earlier. Carl Mollman, 1950. His friend Brubeck, I'm not really sure. Joseph Garamond, 1963. Henry Keller and William Zorak, 1966, all long before him. I personally was 24 when he passed away. I grew up having Sunday meals at his house and spending time there during the summers. What I remember most about him was that he was always with a sketch pad drawing something. The people in the room, the view from the window, the flowers on the table, always. This was something he did clearly for pleasure. His studio was the second floor of the Parma house he had built, and it was filled to overflowing with the works he had produced, the paintings, the sketches, the ideas. But the first thing he wanted to do when you visited was share that work with you. I think this goes to the idea of the collective that I started with. By the end of his life, his club was his family, and I must say that his art is owned and treasured by an incredibly large number of extended family members. I think in part that is why all of us, my brother and sisters, feel so devoted to its preservation and to the responsibility that owning art requires. So thank you to the Canton Museum. Thank you, everyone, for having me and allowing me to make this presentation.